Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1862, and the Ozark Hills were already steeped in tension. The Civil War had carved Missouri into a patchwork of loyalties. Farms were abandoned, men disappeared into militias, and the dirt roads of the region grew quiet except for the creak of wagon wheels or the distant echo of rifles in the valleys. This was a land at once beautiful and brutal, where survival often depended on silence and secrecy. Amid this setting, whispers began to stir about a solitary woman who kept a small orchard near the edge of a settlement road, just beyond the Gasconade River. She was known only as the Widow, her Christian name rarely spoken, as though the people who passed her gate found it easier to speak of her role than her identity. She was described as narrow-faced, dressed perpetually in black, and carrying herself with a calmness that unsettled neighbors more than any outward display of grief. Boarders, mostly drifters or war-displaced travelers, were said to stay at her homestead for a few nights. Her orchard, where twisted apple trees clung stubbornly to the rocky soil, became a landmark for strangers seeking shelter. Records in the county courthouse, those that survived fire years later, mention small payments in her hand, ink entries noting meals, stays, and brief labor in exchange for bed and board. It was, on the surface, ordinary, but people spoke of how those boarders seldom returned to the main road. Few were remembered leaving, and fewer still could be accounted for. Folklorists later tied her case to the general disorder of the period, noting that even official reports from the American Civil War in Missouri described the countryside as dangerous for the lone traveler, subject to sudden disappearance. But the locals claimed something different, that while the war made men vanish, it was the widow's orchard that swallowed them whole. The first testimony of suspicion comes from a neighbor, one John Elkins, who appeared in a newspaper clipping decades later. "I saw them pass her gate," he said, of two young farmhands. "They had their hats in hand, polite enough, but they never passed mine again." Her orchard was bordered by a low, crooked fence, and beneath its gnarled trees the soil always seemed disturbed, as if newly turned. Some said she was merely diligent with her plantings, burying compost and scraps to feed the roots. Others muttered that the ground swallowed more than scraps. By autumn of 1862, as the war darkened further, the rumors had grown louder than the gunfire in the valleys. The widow's stillness, her pale countenance, and her orchard that seemed too fertile for the stony Ozark ground became subjects of nightly talk in taverns. Yet no lawman dared press too far. Sheriffs themselves were wary of traveling those roads at dusk. The case file, if one can call it that, begins here, with scattered ledger entries, fading recollections, and the first suggestion that beneath the apple trees lay something far less nourishing than compost. The land records of Pulaski County place the widow's property on a narrow ridge where the soil thinned into limestone shelves. From a distance, her small orchard appeared almost out of place, a green patch clinging stubbornly to inhospitable ground. Surveyor's notes from 1859 describe a modest homestead, female occupant, orchard of fair yield. No husband's name appears alongside hers, only the terse designation widow, as though the clerk himself assumed further explanation unnecessary. In those years, women widowed by sickness or war were not unusual. But this woman's isolation stood out. She had no surviving children to speak of, no kin living nearby, and her visitors were transient, railway hands, peddlers, and displaced families who arrived weary from the divided front lines. The war had made Missouri a crossroads of loyalty, and the Ozarks, though remote, felt the pressure of armies and raiding bands alike. Neighbors said she spoke little, her voice flat and without inflection. One account, preserved in the diary of a Methodist minister named Reverend Latham, describes her attending service only once. Her expression was vacant, he wrote, and she left before the final hymn, walking alone into the rain. The congregation remarked on her silence as though it were an offense. It was around this time that disappearances began to find their way into tavern conversations. A German immigrant family, the Schmidts, remembered sending their son through the valley with 2 traveling companions in 1862. The young men were last seen at a roadside store in Waynesville, mentioning they might seek shelter at the widow's orchard before crossing the river. None were heard from again. When questions arose, she denied ever meeting them. Her ledgers, those pages later recovered from a half-burned trunk, showed no entry matching their names. And yet the soil at the edge of her orchard was seen freshly disturbed that very week. In an era when lawmen struggled even to keep roads safe from deserters, the disappearances raised little official alarm. Constables' notes from that summer are filled with reports of raids, livestock theft, and bushwhacker killings. Against such chaos, 3 missing travelers barely warranted comment. Still, neighbors began to mark the orchard with unease, guiding their children along longer routes to avoid passing her fence. Folklore soon embroidered itself onto fact. Children whispered that the apples carried the taste of iron, that the trunks of her trees bent unnaturally, and that the widow was sometimes seen standing motionless among the branches at dusk, her gaze fixed on the road. Meanwhile, the larger backdrop of the American Civil War in Missouri provided cover for her silence. With so many lives uprooted, the absence of a few more barely stirred the authorities. It is in this convergence of personal rumor and public disorder that the case deepened. By the onset of winter, suspicion was no longer whispered but spoken plainly in letters and court affidavits. Families demanded answers, though none dared dig beneath the trees. The widow herself remained unchanging, still, pale, and silent, with her orchard as the only witness. By early 1863, the widow's homestead had gained a peculiar reputation. Travelers reported a strange quiet upon entering her yard. No dogs barking, no chickens scratching, not even the chatter of birds in the orchard. One tinker, a man named Elias Crow, told his daughter years later that he had never known a place where even the wind seemed to pause. He claimed the widow offered him a meal of cornbread and beans, but spoke not a word as he ate. When he attempted to make polite conversation about the war, she only stared at him with those glassy, unblinking eyes until he felt compelled to leave. The first official notice comes from a court affidavit preserved in the county archives, though the document itself is half-charred from a courthouse fire in the 1890s. It records a complaint by a farmer named Silas Dugan, who alleged that his cousin vanished after taking shelter at the widow's orchard. The affidavit states, he was last observed upon the widow's property, having been welcomed within. He was not seen henceforth. Local clergy began to raise concerns as well. Reverend Latham, already unsettled by her earlier appearance at church, wrote in a private note, "It is as though the widow exists outside our fellowship, untouched by grief or mercy. Her orchard grows in richness, even as our congregation shrinks by war and hunger." These words, though not published, would later surface in a collection of church papers discovered in the 1920s. And yet, each time a neighbor pressed her, she gave the same response. She had seen no such travelers. Her ledgers, carefully inked, bore no trace of their names. Some suspected she destroyed pages, though the surviving entries seem methodical, as though she wished to maintain the appearance of transparency. The war provided ample distraction. Missouri's newspapers were filled with reports of raids, executions, and military skirmishes. In this noise, the stories of a few missing men from the hills seemed insignificant. Still, the widow's orchard became a point of unease. Neighbors remarked that the soil beneath her trees was often freshly turned, though no planting season explained it. One woman, Sarah Elkins, recalled in a deposition decades later, "I passed her fence at dusk and saw her with a spade, though no seeds were at her feet." What deepened the mystery was the consistency of her demeanor. She showed no panic, no attempt at concealment. She continued tending her orchard, appearing occasionally in town to purchase salt, flour, or lamp oil. Witnesses described her as unmoved, neither friendly nor hostile, but altogether apart. By the summer of 1863, whispers grew darker. Some suggested she was burying more than produce scraps beneath those trees. Others hinted that the widow herself was an omen, her orchard fed by what the war had abandoned. Still, no lawman confronted her directly. In a state where even sheriffs were accused of taking sides, few wished to stir more unrest. And so the orchard remained, green, silent, and heavy with fruit, while those who entered her gate were not seen again. As the Civil War raged on, the widow's story slipped between the cracks of official record and local rumor. In a region where loyalties shifted with each passing regiment, the county constables often chose avoidance over inquiry. "Best leave her be," one deputy was said to remark in a tavern, "for there's more danger in her orchard than on the road." Though no such words appear in the surviving records, the sentiment reflects what many believed but dared not inscribe. Yet evidence began to accumulate in scattered form. A wagon wheel was discovered abandoned at the edge of the widow's property, its spokes cracked, its owner never identified. County ledgers list 2 peddlers missing in late 1863, last noted traveling along the Ridge Road. And in the charred remnants of the courthouse archives, there survives a page of testimony by one Andrew Pettis, a blacksmith, who claimed, "I saw a man's boot protruding from the soil between her apple rows, but when I returned with a companion, the ground was smooth and unbroken." Such accounts were dismissed as tavern talk at the time, but they echo across later recollections, always returning to the orchard. It was not merely the disappearances that troubled neighbors, but the uncanny fertility of her trees. Against thin, stony ground her apples grew larger, their skins waxy, their flavor strangely metallic. Some swore they smelled faintly of rust when sliced. The backdrop of the American Civil War in Missouri gave these stories a grim plausibility. Hundreds vanished in raids, conscriptions, or midnight executions. Missing men were simply another tally in the chaos. Still, families close to the widow's homestead refused to accept war as explanation. They wrote to officials in Jefferson City, though no response ever came. A traveling circuit judge, passing through Waynesville, noted in his journal, "The widow of the orchard is oft spoken of in whispers. No charges laid, yet fear binds the tongue of every farmer." His entry, preserved in a family collection, would later bolster the legend that officials knew more than they admitted. By the winter of 1863, the widow had become a figure of dread, a silhouette glimpsed by travelers but rarely approached. She was said to stand motionless among her trees at night, the faint glow of a lantern at her side. Whether she kept vigil over her orchard or watched the road for new arrivals, no one could say. Yet one truth seemed inescapable. Those who entered her gate seldom returned. And while the war offered cover for many disappearances, the soil beneath her apple trees told a different story. One few were brave enough to disturb. By 1864, the widow's orchard had become a place of avoidance. Travelers approaching the ridge would often quicken their pace, some choosing to detour several miles rather than pass her crooked fence. Local lore remembers that children were warned, "Step not where her apples fall, for the ground holds more than roots." Still, there were those who entered, whether out of desperation or disbelief. One such man was a Union deserter, known in records only as Private T. Wainwright. He was seen limping toward her gate, wounded, in late spring. A neighbor later swore to have glimpsed him through the widow's window, seated at her table with bandaged leg. Yet no soldier matching his description was ever listed in local hospitals or exchanged in prisoner rolls. His fate dissolved into the soil of rumor. County newspapers of that era rarely mention her by name, but faint allusions appear. In the Springfield Advertiser of June 1864, an article on rural lawlessness refers vaguely to an orchard of ill report. Whether this points directly to the widow remains debated, but in the quiet towns of the Ozarks, the meaning was understood. Her orchard itself was studied with suspicion. Farmers who walked the rows noticed uneven mounds, subtle rises where the earth had been turned. When questioned, she claimed she was burying compost or fallen fruit. Yet those who worked the land knew the difference between tilled soil and a grave. One of the few direct confrontations comes from a testimony attributed to Elijah Boone, a distant cousin of the famed frontiersman. In 1872, Boone recalled that he once knocked upon her door to ask about 2 missing cattle drovers. She offered him water, but no answers, her expression flat, her eyes reflecting the lantern light as if made of glass. Boone left unsettled, later telling neighbors that he felt the orchard itself was listening. It was during this period that clergy again raised concerns. Reverend Latham noted in his sermons the rising fear of silent evil in our midst, a phrase some parishioners believed pointed to the widow. His notes, preserved in church archives, remark, "Soil not meant for men has been made to receive them. Our Lord sees even the hidden furrows." And yet, no inquiry advanced. Officials cited the war as reason enough for disappearances, and families were left with silence in place of justice. The orchard continued to bear fruit, its branches heavy even in lean years. Some whispered that the widow sold her apples in town, though others swore no one would touch them. By the year's end, the legend had grown larger than the woman herself. She was no longer merely a widow. She was a symbol of dread, her orchard a boundary between the known and the unspeakable. And though the war's chaos excused many absences, in the hills of the Missouri Ozarks, people had begun to wonder if the soil itself might one day reveal its secrets. The summer of 1865 brought with it the war's official end, yet peace did not return to the Ozarks. The fields lay scarred, men were missing, and families had fractured beyond repair. In this fragile calm, the widow's orchard stood unchanged, the same crooked fence, the same gnarled apple trees, the same unsettling silence. What had once been attributed to wartime chaos now stood out more starkly against the stillness of Reconstruction. It was in this year that a circuit-riding physician, Dr. Horace Kincaid, visited the settlement. His journal, preserved by his descendants, contains a chilling note. A widow in black, of pale demeanor, receives travelers, but keeps no household accounts of their departure. Her orchard soil appears irregular, and the villagers speak of vanished men. I find their fears plausible. His medical tone, dry, observational, unsensational, lent credibility to what others had only whispered. Neighbors also noticed changes in the widow's behavior. Though she remained quiet and withdrawn, she was seen carrying tools into her orchard at odd hours, a spade, a lantern, occasionally a heavy sack slung across her narrow shoulders. A young farm girl named Martha Elkins testified decades later that she once spied the widow lowering something long and wrapped into a shallow pit beneath an apple tree. She patted the soil flat as though it were a child's blanket, Martha recalled, and then she stood there, still as stone, for near an hour. The orchard itself seemed to thrive unnaturally. While nearby farms suffered from blight, her apples appeared polished, near perfect in their sheen. Some townsfolk refused to eat them, muttering that they were nourished by what ought never to feed a tree. Yet curiosity lured a few. A traveler wrote in his pocket diary that the apples had a queer flavor, sharp as iron on the tongue. That page, brittle with age, survived, as in a county archive collection. By now, the widow's reputation had reached beyond the valley. Letters preserved in the Missouri Historical Society reveal correspondence between county officials and the state capitol, though none mention her name outright. They refer instead to a suspicious orchard and the question of whether federal investigators should intervene. No evidence suggests they ever did. Meanwhile, folklore deepened. Children dared one another to pluck apples from her fence line, claiming the fruit would bleed when bitten. Others swore they saw shadows beneath the trees at night, figures crouched low as though still tethered to the soil. Such stories blurred the line between rumor and record, but they cemented the orchard's place in local fear. In his closing notes for that year, Reverend Latham invoked her yet again without naming her. The war has ended, but evil wears no uniform. It dwells among us in silence, feeding its orchard with the forgotten. And so, as the rest of Missouri struggled to rebuild, the widow's orchard grew heavier with both fruit and suspicion, standing as a reminder that not all horrors of that era marched in uniform. Some lingered at the edge of the road, waiting with unblinking eyes. The first true attempt at investigation came in the spring of 1866, when a small group of townsmen resolved to confront the widow directly. Their leader was a storekeeper named Calvin Mercer, who had grown weary of hearing accounts of missing drovers and travelers. Mercer's grandson would later record the tale in a family letter. They meant not to accuse, but to seek clarity. Yet even before they reached her gate, dread overtook them. According to that letter, the men found the widow seated on her porch, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed squarely upon them. She neither rose nor spoke as they approached. When Mercer asked if they might search her orchard, she finally answered with a single word: no. The account describes the men standing in silence, each unwilling to press further. The orchard loomed behind her, rows of trees heavy with blossom, the air still as stone. They left without argument. Later that summer, the men returned alone to dig near the fence line, careful not to be seen. Their spades struck not coffins, but only soil and roots. Yet one of them, a farmer named Henry Clay, insisted he smelled something foul and iron-like beneath the earth. He abandoned the effort, declaring that some ground is not meant for disturbance. Meanwhile, fresh stories arose. A tinker claimed he glimpsed a length of cloth protruding from the soil, pale in the moonlight. But when he returned at dawn, the ground was smooth once more. A schoolteacher traveling through the valley wrote in her journal of a widow whose eyes reflect lantern light like polished glass, remarking that the very air of her orchard felt suffocating. The American Civil War in Missouri continued to be cited by officials as explanation for the ongoing losses. Newspapers printed columns of the dead and missing, their names stretching for pages. Against this backdrop, the widow's case remained invisible to all but her neighbors. Still, whispers circulated more widely. Stagecoach drivers told passengers to beware the orchard widow, and maps drawn by surveyors sometimes marked the ridge with a faint W. By the late 1860s, she had become less a woman than a figure of dread, her property an unspoken boundary. One curious detail emerges in this period. Though many feared her orchard, few claimed to see her age. Descriptions from 1862 to 1868 remain eerily consistent: pale skin, sharp features, black attire, unsmiling expression. In a community where hardship aged men and women rapidly, the widow seemed frozen in time. Whether this was truth or simply the exaggeration of rumor, it added to her legend. By the decade's end, the widow's orchard was not merely avoided, but actively shunned. Farmers turned their plows before reaching her fence. Children crossed themselves when passing her gate. And still, travelers entered, and still they failed to return. In the late 1860s, officials began at last to notice the accumulation of complaints. County clerks, pressed by persistent families, filed a brief inquiry into disappearances along the Ridge Road. The widow's property was not named outright, but the description of an orchard at the valley's edge near the Gasconade left little doubt. The report, however, was inconclusive. It cited the instability of the era, the poverty of record-keeping, and the unreliability of tavern testimony. In short, it dismissed what locals had whispered for years. Yet to the people of the Ozarks, the widow's orchard had already become synonymous with danger. Tales of her silence spread through the hill country. Travelers spoke of pausing at her fence, uncertain whether to knock or continue on. A few who dared accept her hospitality returned to tell of odd meals, bread without salt, water that tasted metallic, and the unrelenting stare of their hostess. A farmer named Joshua Drummond left a particularly unsettling account. He claimed to have stayed the night in her loft after a wagon mishap. The orchard glowed faintly by lantern light, he later wrote. I swear I heard the sound of spades at work long past midnight, though no other soul was visible. Drummond survived the visit, but admitted he never traveled that road again. Folklore deepened around such testimony. Children claimed the apples from her orchard, when cut, bled red juice instead of clear. Others swore that shadows moved independently among the trees, even on moonless nights. Whether these were inventions or memories distorted by fear, they became inseparable from the story. By this time, scholars note, Missouri itself was shifting. Reconstruction efforts were slow and uneven, and the scars of the American Civil War in Missouri lingered in burned homesteads and fractured families. In such a setting, suspicion easily took root, feeding the legend of the widow as both scapegoat and symbol of loss. Yet one cannot ignore the persistence of specific details. Soil repeatedly disturbed, travelers last seen at her gate, testimonies of sounds at night. Even dismissing the folklore, the pattern suggests something more than rumor. Still, no constable dared execute a search warrant, and no judge issued charges. Instead, the widow remained undisturbed, her orchard flourishing while other farms faltered. To her neighbors, this alone was cause for suspicion. "The land gives back what it receives," said one elderly farmer decades later, "and hers gave too much." By 1870, the widow had faded into a figure of folklore, yet her orchard remained a real place, its crooked fence and silent rows still visible to anyone passing along the ridge. And while the war had ended, the unease it birthed endured, rooted, it seemed, as deeply as the bodies some believed were hidden beneath her trees. The census of 1870 lists the widow only by surname, with her age marked as about 40. The entry is stark, offering no occupation beyond household. Neighbors remarked that she appeared unchanged from years prior, her hair dark, her figure lean, her face drawn but ageless. In communities accustomed to hardship leaving visible marks, her stillness unsettled more than wrinkles ever could. That same year, a circuit judge passing through Waynesville recorded in his travel log, "The widow is spoken of with fear, as if she were a curse upon the valley. Men vanish, and yet no hand of law dares stir her orchard." His words suggest the authorities were well aware of the suspicion, but unwilling, or perhaps too fearful, to act. By now, the stories had grown darker. Some travelers claimed that she invited boarders to work her orchard in exchange for meals. They were seen digging, their shovels striking the hard soil between apple trees. None were seen leaving. The image of men unknowingly digging their own graves became a motif repeated in folklore well into the 20th century. One particularly vivid tale comes from an aging settler, Samuel Wren, who spoke to his grandson in 1901. Wren recalled seeing lantern light in the orchard one foggy evening, the widow standing still while two figures bent low, spading the soil. When Wren returned the next morning, the orchard was empty. He never learned the men's names, nor did he ask. Still, there were skeptics. Some insisted the widow was merely a recluse whose land became a convenient target for wartime fears. They argued that missing men were victims of guerrillas, not a solitary woman. But the skeptics never explained the repeated, consistent detail of freshly disturbed soil, nor the ledger entries cut short, as if travelers had begun a transaction they never finished. By the mid-1870s, the orchard was no longer spoken of in direct terms. Families avoided the subject in polite company, though children carried the legend into their games. They dared one another to walk past her fence at night, whispering that if the widow looked at you, your shadow would never follow you home again. And yet, through all the whispers and sightings, the widow herself remained unchanged. She walked to town for flour and lamp oil. She returned alone, her pale face visible beneath her black bonnet. When spoken to, she replied with only the briefest words. No accusation touched her. No inquiry disturbed her soil. The orchard, however, grew heavier with meaning. To locals, its silence became louder than any rifle fire they had endured during the war. It was no longer just a place of apples, but a boundary between what could be named and what must remain buried. By 1875, the widow's orchard had passed fully into the language of rumor. Though she lived still upon the ridge, her name appeared less often in formal records, as if clerks themselves avoided inscribing it. Tax rolls note her land, the orchard assessed modestly, yet no mention is made of boarders or hired help. She was, officially, alone. The testimonies that survive from this decade are fragments, preserved in letters and diaries. One letter, penned by a traveling school inspector named Edwin Jarvis, describes pausing at the widow's gate for directions. She stood in her orchard as still as stone. When she turned, her eyes reflected the lantern's flame with such brightness that I mistook them for glass. She spoke few words, but I felt dismissed rather than answered. Jarvis did not linger, and his letter ends with the phrase, "I resolved never to pass that way again." Around this time, orchard soil was again noted as disturbed. A farmer repairing a boundary fence reported mounds that appeared freshly turned, their shapes long and narrow. He claimed he heard the widow's spade striking earth in the distance, rhythmic as a metronome, though she was not visible when he turned. His report, given decades later to a county historian, aligns eerily with earlier accounts. The broader landscape of Missouri had changed. Reconstruction brought railroads, telegraph lines, and new settlers. Yet the Ridge Road remained old and half-forgotten, its most notorious landmark still the widow's orchard. Stagecoach drivers told stories of it to amuse passengers, though they never stopped within sight of her fence. The American Civil War in Missouri was invoked less often now, though its shadow lingered. Older families explained the disappearances as war ghosts, men who never truly returned. But younger generations believed differently. To them, the widow's orchard was not symbolic buzz, but literal, a place where lives had ended in silence. A particularly striking account comes from a traveling preacher, Reverend Amos Tate, who wrote in his journal that he attempted to speak scripture to her from the road. She did not move nor lift her gaze. Only the orchard behind her seemed to stir, as though the trees themselves leaned nearer. I felt compelled to leave, fearing my own words had no place there. By the decade's close, the widow's orchard was described less as farmland and more as a boundary marker. Maps made by surveyors often omitted her homestead entirely, skipping from one farm to the next, as if her land were a void. It was, in every sense, a blank space, yet one heavy with meaning for those who lived nearby. And still, the disappearances continued, not in great numbers, not in ways that could provoke official action, but enough that the whispers never ceased. Each vanished traveler seemed to deepen the soil beneath her trees, even as her figure remained unchanged, silent among the branches. By 1878, the widow's orchard had become a story carried well beyond the Ozarks. Travelers along the post roads repeated it as a cautionary tale. Do not accept lodging from solitary women in black. Do not linger near orchards where the ground seems freshly turned. The legend took on a life of its own, reshaped each time it was told, yet always rooted in the same place, her crooked fence and silent rows of apple trees. Court records from this period reveal a curious absence. Several families filed notices of missing kin who had last been seen traveling through Pulaski County. None of these petitions mention the widow directly, yet their descriptions of lodgings near the Ridge Road point unmistakably toward her homestead. Officials acknowledged the petitions, but cited insufficient evidence for further inquiry. The missing were quietly listed among the countless displaced of the era. Meanwhile, oral testimonies became increasingly strange. A drover named Patrick Coyle told his granddaughter that he once heard cries from the orchard at dusk, muffled as though beneath earth. Terrified, he ran without stopping until he reached the next settlement. Decades later, his granddaughter recalled the story with a shudder. He swore the ground itself was speaking. It was also around this time that her orchard bore its most unnatural yield. Neighbors described apples that grew to unusual size, their skins flawless and cold to the touch. Some said the fruit did not rot when left to sit, but instead shriveled into a leathery husk as though refusing decay. Whether this was true or embellishment, it spread quickly, feeding the legend further. Folklore collectors in the early 20th century would later note that such stories echoed other rural myths of the era, where uncanny fertility was tied to hidden crime. Still, the widow's orchard stood out for its consistency. Generation A after generation recalled the same details: disturbed soil, silent hostess, vanishing travelers. References to the American Civil War in Missouri grew more distant by now, invoked mainly by older residents to explain why her case had never been pursued. In those years, one farmer remarked, the law had no eyes for our hills. The war blinded them, and by the time peace returned, the orchard had grown too deep. Yet the widow herself remained unchanged. She was glimpsed walking into town, purchasing salt, kerosene, and cloth. She carried herself with the same stiff posture, her face pale, her expression flat. Witnesses insisted she seemed untouched by age, her black garments as stark in 1878 as they had been in 1862. Whether this was truth or the exaggeration of rumor, it unsettled those who saw her. By the end of the decade, the orchard was less a farm than a boundary of silence. No one entered willingly, yet its shadow stretched across the valley. It was said that the trees bore witness to what men feared to speak, their branches heavy not only with apples, but with secrets. The 1880 census again lists the widow on the ridge, though now her age is marked ambiguously. About 50. Strangely, the handwriting suggests hesitation, as if the enumerator himself was uncertain. Neighbors remarked afterward that she looked no older than when they first saw her nearly 20 years before. "Time passes her by," one woman whispered, "but the orchard does not forget." It was in this decade that the orchard drew the attention of amateur chroniclers. A local schoolteacher, Miss Clara Jennings, collected tales from her pupils and their families. Her notebook, discovered years later in an attic trunk, contains entries describing the widow's habits, how she walked her rows at dusk with a lantern, how she carried a spade even when no planting season was near, how no one ever saw smoke rise from her chimney, though she lived there year-round. Jennings herself added a chilling line, "I wonder if her orchard feeds her more than her orchard feeds us." Another document from this period, a constable's memorandum, describes a failed attempt to survey the property. Ordered by county officials to resolve a boundary dispute, 2 men arrived at the widow's gate. They reported that she refused them entry, standing motionless in her orchard until they departed. The memorandum ends tersely. Property line unresolved, not worth the trouble. Folklore flourished in the absence of action. Children dared one another to pluck apples from her trees, swearing that the fruit turned bitter in their mouths. Some claimed to hear low voices when standing too near the fence, as though the soil itself murmured. Parents scolded them, yet the stories passed from mouth to mouth, embedding themselves deeper into the region's collective memory. The broader world was changing. Railroads cut new paths through Missouri, commerce grew, and towns expanded. Yet the Ridge Road remained old and mid. Petty unaltered, its most infamous landmark still the widow's orchard. To outsiders it was a curiosity, but to locals it was a wound never healed. By 1885, letters from the valley mentioned the orchard with resigned familiarity. One farmer wrote to his cousin in St. Louis, "The widow yet lives, and her apples still gleam red as iron. We do not speak of her openly, but none here doubts the ground is heavy with what it holds." It was a period of uneasy coexistence. The widow did not leave, and the community did not force her out. Instead, the orchard stood as a reminder of what they feared, yet refused to confront. In taverns, old men said the county had buried its conscience there, along with the missing. And still she walked into town, silent, unchanged, her black bonnet low over her pale face. Time moved forward, but for the widow, and for her orchard, it seemed always the same. By the late 1880s, the widow's story had hardened into legend, even as she herself remained a living presence. Travelers through the Ozarks reported hearing of the orchard widow before they ever saw the Ridge Road. She had become a cautionary tale told in inns and stage stops, a reminder that not all dangers wore uniforms or carried pistols. A particularly striking account comes from a journalist, Thomas Harlan, who passed through Pulaski County in 1887. In his notebook, later donated to a regional archive, he describes the orchard in detail. The trees are gnarled and leaning, their fruit bright even in shade. The woman who tends them is pale, severe, unspeaking. Villagers hint at vanishings, yet none will name her directly. They look away when asked, as if the orchard listens. Harlan left unsettled, writing only that he would not spend the night within its reach. The folklore of this decade grew more elaborate. Children whispered that the orchard's apples could show visions if cut at midnight. Farmers told of hearing the sound of digging carried on the wind, steady and rhythmic, though no one could find the source. Others swore that travelers seen entering the widow's gate appeared again, years later only in dreams, their faces pale, their voices hollow. Still, records ground the legend in grim repetition. At least 3 men were reported missing in the county between 1886 and 1889. Each was last noted traveling the Ridge Road. Their families filed petitions, yet once again officials cited uncertain cause, likely banditry. In the margin of one report, a clerk scribbled the words "Orchard Widow" before scratching them out. Even as decades passed, her physical appearance remained unsettlingly constant. Witnesses described the same drawn face, the same bonnet, the same unblinking stare. Some said she looked not merely ageless but preserved, as though she were an other relic of the war that refused to fade. Whether this was truth or the embellishment of memory, it deepened the aura around her name. The war itself had by then passed into history books, yet its shadow lingered in local explanation. Old men still muttered that the chaos of the American Civil War in Missouri had set the stage for her silence, that she thrived in the confusion left behind. To younger generations, however, she was no historical accident, but a figure of enduring dread. By 1890, the widow was no longer spoken of as a neighbor, but as a presence, fixed, immovable, part of the landscape. Families passing her land would cross themselves, and even newcomers quickly learned to avoid her fence. And though no body was ever unearthed, the orchard itself was treated as burial ground, heavy with secrets no one dared exhume. The turn of the 1890s brought renewed attempts by outsiders to pry into the widow's history. Folklore collectors from St. Louis, eager to capture rural legends, visited Pulaski County and noted her story in their journals. They recorded that locals refused to speak her name aloud, referring only to the woman on the ridge or the orchard widow. One collector remarked that the fear surrounding her was unlike ordinary superstition, less a tale for children than a silence enforced upon adults. Meanwhile, disappearances continued, though in smaller numbers. A peddler selling sewing needles vanished in 1891, last seen pushing his cart along the Ridge Road. 2 itinerant preachers were rumored to have stayed at the orchard in 1893 and were never heard from again. Their absence was officially attributed to travel mishaps, yet tavern talk pointed always back to the crooked fence and the soil beneath the trees. Surviving county papers from this decade show an interesting detail. The widow never defaulted on her taxes. Even as neighbors struggled, her modest dues were paid each year in careful handwriting. Officials noted her reliability but avoided direct dealings, preferring to receive her payments by post. It was as though the county itself acknowledged her presence, while wishing never to see her face. A chilling deposition from this era comes from a man named Albert Cross, who claimed to have wandered near the orchard while hunting. He testified years later, "I saw the ground sink slightly, as though settling, and thought it strange. Then I noticed a hand protruding, pale as wax, before the soil closed again. I cannot swear it was real, but I fled, and never returned." His words, preserved in a local historian's collection, capture the blend of terror and uncertainty that defined the orchard's legend. The broader context of the Ozarks was shifting. Railroads brought commerce, and towns grew into bustling centers. Yet the Ridge Road remained curiously unchanged, bypassed by new routes. Some said it was deliberate, that surveyors steered clear, unwilling to cut through land marked by such fear. Folklore of the orchard took on darker tones. Children dared one another to sleep a night against its fence, though few ever tried. Mothers warned that apples plucked from the widow's trees would turn to ash before reaching home. Lantern lights were often reported flickering among the rows, long after the widow was seen retiring to her house. By the close of the decade, she was scarcely seen in town. When she did appear, her figure was described exactly as before, pale, unsmiling, wrapped in black. To some, she was a relic of the American Civil War in Missouri, surviving as though time itself refused to claim her. To others, she was something older, something rooted as deep as the orchard she tended. and through it all, the ground remained undisturbed, at least to the eye. But the people of Pulaski County knew better. The silence of her orchard had become heavier than any cannon fire they had ever endured. By the dawn of the new century, the widow had become less a woman than a myth. The 1900 census lists her only as female, widowed, head of household, age uncertain, her surname misspelled as if the clerk could not recall it clearly. Yet locals swore she had not changed a whit since the 1860s. Pale, rigid, and always in black. Her presence was a constant, even as generations passed. Travelers at this time described her orchard with growing unease. One account from a salesman named Clarence Hodge survives in a family scrapbook. He claimed he passed the widow's gate at dusk and saw lanterns flickering between the trees, though no hand carried them. The orchard breathed like a living thing, he wrote. I quickened my pace and did not look back. Folklore continued to twist around her silence. Children said the orchard's apples, when bitten, revealed not seeds, but small black stones. Farmers muttered that the soil grew warmer near her fence, even in the depths of winter. Skeptics dismissed these tales as exaggerations, yet the consistency of details across decades is difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, official records kept their distance. No charges were ever filed, no searches ordered. Families still petitioned for missing kin, but county officials attributed them to vagrancy or migration west. The phrase, likely gone west, appears repeatedly in margin notes. To the locals, however, the explanation was hollow. They knew the missing had last been seen along the ridge road, within sight of the widow's trees. It was also in this period that scholars of folklore began drawing comparisons to other tales of rural disappearance. Yet they remarked on the singular persistence of this case. Unlike ghost stories that shifted shape, the widow's orchard remained rooted in specific times, names, and places. Each account circled back to her pale figure and the disturbed soil. Some lent an her legend to the lingering scars of the American Civil War in Missouri. They argued that the war's chaos had created a climate where her silence could thrive, and that her orchard became a symbol of what the conflict left buried. Others believed she was no symbol at all, but the quiet hand behind the vanished. Neighbors by then avoided even speaking of her openly. A farmer named Jonas Hale told his son, "The widow has outlived the war, the courts, and even her own years. Leave her orchard alone, for it leaves none who enter." His words, written down by that son decades later, preserved the unease that shadowed her land. And so the century turned, yet the widow and her orchard remained. The world outside Missouri modernized, but on that ridge time seemed arrested, tethered to secrets no one dared disturb. By the 1910s, the widow's orchard was known less as farmland than as a boundary no one crossed. Even those who had never seen her spoke of her with certainty, as though she were carved into the landscape itself. Old maps sometimes marked her ridge with a simple cross, a silent warning to travelers. One of the last direct sightings comes from a postal carrier, Samuel Boyd, who wrote in his logbook of 1911. Delivered parcel at gate. Widow appeared unchanged from years past, pale and unspeaking. Took package without a word. I left quickly. Boyd later told his children that she looked not old, not young, simply fixed, like a photograph come to life. Folklore in this decade leaned heavily toward the supernatural. Children whispered that the orchard trees bent toward strangers, their branches curling low as if to ensnare. Others claimed that at night the ground glowed faintly, lantern light without lanterns. Whether these were embellishments or the shaping of memory, they reinforced the sense that the orchard was alive in its silence. Yet even amid exaggeration, the practical details remained consistent. The vanishings, the disturbed soil, the unchanging figure of the widow. Scholars reviewing old county files noted the eerie pattern. Ledger entries ended abruptly. Affidavits trailed off. Depositions survived only in fragments, many damaged by courthouse fires. It was as though the record itself resisted clarity. Neighbors by then no longer even speculated. They lived alongside the orchard much as one lives near a graveyard, accepting its presence, respecting its silence, never disturbing its ground. Families instructed children to avoid the ridge road entirely, and newcomers were quickly warned away. The wider world was modernizing, telephones, railways, electric lights, but the ridge seemed to resist progress. The widow, still glimpsed occasionally at her fence, Appian, guard unchanged by it all. "She is a relic," wrote a traveling historian in 1915, "a figure who ought to belong to the age of the American Civil War in Missouri, yet who endures into our present." No one could say how she survived. Did she farm? Did she trade? Did she even eat? Some suggested the orchard itself sustained her, though none would dare test the fruit. A rumor spread that a young boy once stole an apple and fell ill, his skin pale and waxen for weeks. No record confirms it, yet the story lingered, repeated in hushed tones. By the close of the decade, the widow was no longer seen regularly in town. Some believed she had finally died, though no obituary exists. Others whispered she remained on the ridge, her orchard shielding her from time itself. And still the crooked fence stood, enclosing soil heavy with silence, fruit heavy with suspicion. By the 1920s, the widow's orchard had passed almost entirely into legend. Younger residents of Pulaski County spoke of her as if she belonged to another century, though a few older neighbors insisted she still lived, seen rarely at twilight along the ridge. "She is there," one farmer told a visiting folklorist, "and the orchard stands because she stands." Folklorists recorded these accounts eagerly. They noted the peculiar consistency of detail across decades: the pale widow, the silent orchard, the vanishings without trace. In their published notes, they described the case as a living folklore, remarkable because the community still behaved as though the legend were present reality. Roads were rerouted, fields were left fallow near her land, and children were warned never to speak her name aloud. One particularly chilling testimony came from a pair of hikers in 1923 who claimed they stumbled upon the orchard while exploring old trails. They reported seeing rows of gnarled apple trees heavy with fruit, though the air carried a metallic tang. A woman in black stood motionless among the branches. When they tried to greet her, she neither spoke nor moved. Terrified, they fled. The hikers later swore that when they glanced back, the figure was gone, yet the orchard glowed faintly, as though lit from within. At the same time, the county attempted modernization. Courthouses were rebuilt, roads improved, schools expanded. Yet when it came to the Ridge Road, progress stalled. Surveyors marked it as impractical, though locals whispered another truth, that no one wanted to cut through the widow's land. The orchard had become an unspoken boundary, too heavy with memory to disturb. The American Civil War in Missouri, by then firmly relegated to history books, was often cited by scholars as the seed of her legend. They argued that the chaos of those years created stories to explain the unexplainable. Yet the people of Pulaski County rejected such theories. To them, the widow was not metaphor but fact. Her orchard was no symbol. It was ground that had swallowed men whole. In taverns, old voices still told of travelers who vanished. One man swore his father had seen lantern light bobbing among the trees long after the widow was believed dead. Another insisted he heard faint digging when the wind carried from the ridge. Skeptics dismissed these tales, but the unease remained. By the decade's end, the widow's orchard had become a paradox, both absent and ever-present, both past and present. Whether she lived still, or had long since been buried beneath her own trees, no one could say. But the soil of the ridge seemed unwilling to release its hold on her story. Into the 1930s and beyond, the widow's orchard lingered in memory more than in sight. New roads bypassed the ridge, and younger families settled elsewhere. Yet when historians interviewed locals, they found the fear remained as steady as ever. No one built on the land, no one tilled its soil. Even hunters avoided it, as though stepping across the crooked fence might invite silence that never ended. By then, the widow herself had vanished from record. No obituary, no probate documents, no sale of property. It was as if she dissolved into the very orchard she tended. Some claimed to see her figure long after her supposed death, pale, rigid, watching from the rows of apple trees. Others whispered of apples left unpicked, rotting in place, though no hand ever reached to gather them. Folklorists who revisited the tale described it as a case where memory outlasted evidence. They noted the persistence of the same details: disturbed soil, vanishing travelers, the unchanging figure of the widow. They argued that the story's longevity tied it less to superstition and more to the community's need to explain an enduring absence. But the locals rejected such academic comfort. To them, the orchard was not a symbol, but a graveyard with no markers. Even today, hikers report unease along the ridge. Some say the air grows heavier near the site, that silence falls unnaturally across the trees. A few claim to hear faint sounds beneath the earth, muffled, rhythmic, like spades striking soil. None linger long enough to confirm. And so the story remains unresolved. Was the widow merely a reclusive woman who became a vessel for wartime fears? Or did her orchard truly hold the bodies of those who vanished along the ridge road? The records are too fragmented to decide, the soil too undisturbed to tell. What is certain is that her orchard outlived the war, the courts, and even her own name. And in the Missouri Ozarks, the ground still whispers of her, and the crooked fence still casts its shadow. And perhaps, if you pass that way at dusk, you may glimpse her too, silent, pale, watching among the apple trees.